Hello, everyone, and welcome to Office Hours. I am Jeff Blankenburg, and as we do every week, we're here to answer your questions about Alexa development and ambient computing and voice design and all the other things. So as we start these episodes, I have a couple of announcements for you. Like last week, I must again mention that we are hosting our February Tech Talk next week, where we're going to be talking about the Skill Quality Coach. I'll have Pranav Rai here with me, and we'll be deep diving on exactly how the Skill Quality Coach works and why developers should care about it. You can find out more of the event on your calendar. We have a landing page for it, and we're posting that in the chat right now. So make sure to join us on Wednesday, February 22nd at 10 a.m. Pacific. We're going to be broadcasting across all of our channels, so it should be super easy to find. But I want to make sure you guys are aware that that Tech Talk is coming up. The other thing that I want to talk about, we started last week offering a Skill Quality Coach tip every week. And so I wanted to share another one of those. Last week, we talked about adding relevant keywords. This week, our tip is about updating skills metadata to provide more information. So if you think about all the descriptions that you have available to you when you build a skill, we have a short description, a long description, and a number of other fields that we can fill in. I can't emphasize enough that really making sure you use the what's new field inside your description. So we have a short description, a long description, and then there's a box called what's new. That what's new box is designed to let people know what their most recent update for your skill happened to be. So if you've pushed a new update this week or last week or whatever, it's important to let people know that, like, hey, here are the things that changed. Here are the new things you might want to try saying. And it goes a long way, not only in discoverability, which means you're adding new keywords that people may find in their searches, but for people that are finding your skill, they can also see that, one, it's being regularly updated, so it seems like it's a modern, refresh skill, but two, that it has the kind of content that they're specifically looking for. So that is our tip for the week. Make sure you're using that what's new field. I think it'll go a long way in helping your skill to be discovered. So Amanda, welcome to the show.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Lang. I'm one of the Alexa evangelists along with Jeff, and I'm going to be along with the show today. I also want to mention, as part of our announcements, that next week we're going to have Kunal Shanichara, who's a senior solution architect from the Alexa Skills Developer Tech team. And they're going to be joining us to discuss skills A/B testing, so A/B testing, experimenting with your skills, and skills account linking, which is available to link the user accounts with other users' Amazon accounts. Awesome. It's going to be a really interesting talk.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing from Kunal. That'll be good. So, okay, that's all the announcements. Let's get all those things out of the way. I want to bring our guest in. So you guys may have seen her before or read a lot of the things that she's written. But Alison Atwell, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Alison.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Certainly. So we're here primarily to talk to you about the Alexa Design Guide. But I'd love to start with kind of what your role is on the team, some of the kinds of things that people may have seen your work in.
Yeah, I'm a senior VUI designer, voice UI designer, or conversation designer. We'll talk about that in a minute. Senior conversation designer at Alexa Skills Kit. That's a fancy way of saying I help other folks improve and launch their skills, and sometimes I design skills myself. We'll talk about what design looks like as well a little bit later. And I've been doing this. I've been working with Alexa Skills at Amazon for a little over 5 years now. And in that time, I've helped launch, design and launch hundreds of skills. And that is anywhere from some of our Sony Entertainment skills, some of the revisions to Jeopardy, launching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, to some smaller skills and helping some startups launch. So some skills, made by one person. So we hundreds of skills. I've seen a lot of skills.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, some of the skills that I've worked on behind the scenes, Alison has had a hand in those too. I often lean on her as a consultant for, hey, how should I handle this, or how should I think about this situation? So she is an incredibly valuable resource when it comes to thinking about conversation design. I was actually curious because I actually don't know the answer to this question. What is your background? You said you've been doing conversational design here at Alexa for about 5 years, but how do you get here? Yeah. I'm sure some people would be like, how do I become a conversation designer? That sounds awesome.
One can find conversation design a number of routes. My background is actually, this part of my career is the perfect mix of two things I have done as a career. First, I was a journalist. That's my first degree. And then I decided that wasn't for me, and I went back to school for design, and then I was a UX designer for about 6 years before I came to Amazon. And my only experience with conversation design before I landed at Amazon working with Alexa was kind of some basic chatbots, really early, like the Microsoft Kinect camera had some basic voice commands. The HoloLens had some basic voice commands. I was mostly working in the VR space though. So it's a mixture of UX design and my writing background that came together into writing the things that Alexa would say or a skill should say.
Love it. All right. So for
That's so
those that may
cool.
be like, all right, cool, we're talking to a conversation designer. What is conversation design? Can you give us your thoughts on what that subject is? Because it's pretty broad and reaching, but I'd love your perspective.
The way I like to describe it and put it most simply is conversation design is what you decide the appropriate response is for our purposes, your skill. What is your skill's appropriate response to something that the speaker said, plus the knowledge, any of the knowledge that you have about them, their context. So whatever they said plus their context equals what makes sense to say. And so I'll actually use an example, like a real conversation example, and then we'll like apply that logic to a skill. So when you and I talked yesterday, Jeff, we haven't talked in a long time, but we know each other quite well and we've worked together before. And so it's like, hey, old friend, how are you doing? Long time no see. We greeted each other in a certain way. That was step one of our conversation. When we greeted each other this morning, it was like, oh, hey, yeah, we talked yesterday. Yeah, long time no see, because we're humans and we understand irony. So if we apply that to a skill, just step one, greeting the person when they come in for a skill, the conversation design happens when we decide what is the appropriate thing to say. And maybe we question whether the person would get our irony if we said, hey, long time no see, if they haven't visited our skill in 6 weeks. Maybe that would be a funny thing to do. I don't know. That's up to you as the conversation designer. So we're applying what the person said plus their context. That's, we want to find the best possible response. And that process is your conversation design.
I like that. And that was a good analogy because it was almost a very indifferent greeting today. But it was so joyful and like, I'm so glad to see you again yesterday.
Great.
It is an interesting way to think about conversation. And one of the things that I know that I've done in a lot of my skills is I try to remember as much as I possibly can about what I've said to a user before. Yep. And so they, every time that I talk with them, whether it's just a simple greeting or a reminder, I don't want to bombard them with the same kinds of things over and over, especially in the same way. And what I find is I generate a ton of data, but it can become incredibly useful and customized to how a user interacts with the skill because they don't feel like they're just getting the same repetitive nonsense over and over, even though that's very possible.
Right. And that's actually one thing I suggest, even without, before I even look at someone's like skill design, one of the questions I ask them is, have you thought about someone who's going to use your skill more than once, and what parts of your skill is somebody going to hear about all the time? What are those like kind of high traffic dialogues? What is your skill going to talk about the most? What is your customer going to do the most? And vary those, whether it's randomizing them or figuring out some other formula. This even happens to the best of us. I'll give you a funny example. There was a skill that we launched recently where I did several iterations of this very specific part of the skill where I was searching for something, and you could use a lot of filters to filter down to the singular thing that you wanted, but there was a lot of steps involved in doing that. And Alexa would say, okay, repeat what you said. Okay, that. I found this. Do you want that? But once you do that more than once, it starts to sound very robotic. So we had to randomize different pieces of the conversation. Okay, got it. You bet, et cetera, et cetera. And then instead of what would you like and opening the mic every single time, it's how about that one? et cetera, et cetera. That's a
Right.
huge thing you can do in your skill right away.
Yeah. No, that is a practice I employ heavily. I have an entire database table that's just dedicated to speech, and each fragment of speech type has its own label. And so I can go in and get a sentence prefix. I can get I call them an action query, but it's those trailing questions you always end with, like, what else can I help you with, right? Those are action queries to me. And so I string all of those things together, but that means that every single time any individual user talks to a skill, they're hearing what is probably a unique sentence from my skill. It's not been said before. It's pretty cool.
That's super interesting because I feel
like
if you're writing a terminal application, you want a repetitive response that's very predictable. But with skill design, it's the opposite, you think?
Oh, people tire of hearing the same thing. It's there's two parts to that. One, there's an uncanny valley effect in voice, as well as, you know, what we traditionally know to be the uncanny valley of something looking human. It sounds human, but something's off. It's not quite human. So if you were having a conversation with a person and they said the same thing in the same session the same way, it would like kind of freak you out a little bit. But then also over a long period of time, we find that dialogues that do that, people just get tired of hearing the same thing and they just don't come back to this skill. So they might use the skill a few times and then not come back. However, a really good step one, though, is when you have a concept for a skill and you start the design process, and you just write through, you know, one really good conversation, like the best experience somebody could have in your skill, whatever it is you want to help them do. Then go ahead and break that down like Jeff did into what are the parts of the speech, and then think about all the different patterns you can use with all of those slot values and the different parts of the speech, and, you know, iterate on it. But you can start with just one dialogue to begin with.
Yeah. But, and I think that's an interesting observation, because that's something that I talk about a lot in a talk that I give, is that when we think about building for web and for mobile and a lot of the other places that we've built software, it's all about consistency and reliability and predictability. And with voice, I argue that it is exactly the opposite. I want to keep people on their toes. I don't want them to know what they're going to hear next, for a variety of reasons. One, it feels like a conversation, but selfishly, it forces them to pay attention. And it's very easy when you're talking with a voice assistant, especially if it's talking for a few sentences, to tune out and just wait for the opportunity to speak again. And by forcing them to pay attention because they don't know what's coming, they have a better experience, because now they're actually paying attention to what the conversation is instead of just waiting for their chance to talk.
Yeah, that's a really interesting strategy. I don't think I've thought of it before like that, where if they don't know quite what to expect, they'll be paying attention. That's a smooth move like that.
Right.
There are some times where you want to be predictable, like there's maybe like a financial consequence to something you're doing, paying a bill, ordering a pizza, whatever it is, where it costs real money. I've accidentally ordered too many things with Alexa before. We'll just say that.
Well,
But you're absolutely right, though. When you have that variety, people do keep coming back just to see, you know, kind of what will happen next. Or people will tend to experiment. And you can see this in your analytics when people are just experimenting, trying to see what your skill can do. That's a very good sign.
Yeah. Well, it's that unpredictability. Like you talked about ordering a pizza. Certainly, I wouldn't want to prevent them from being able to get directly to ordering a pizza. But on the same token, if there's a series of questions that I need to ask them in order to complete their order, there's no rules that say I have to ask those in that specific order. And so where the first time you ordered a pizza, it was what toppings do you want? What sides do you want? What drinks do you want? The next time I might say, okay, I've got your pizza order. What drinks do you want? Now, what sides do you want? Like just mixing it up a little bit forces them to be like, oh, they said sides. Okay, I've got to pay attention to this and talk about that thing. Where if they've done it 4, 5, 6 times, they tune out and they're just like, yeah, I want the breadsticks. I want the thing, like, and they're just trying to check their boxes. So I refer to it as hacking humans. You have to keep them on their toes enough to pay attention, which will cause them to have a good experience, where if they naturally tune out, they have a bad experience and they blame it on your skill. And it's not really your skill's fault. It's just that humans are prone to get bored.
Right. really fickle creatures. Although, and that's probably the case because we are just like the most evolved communication machines, and we know best how to use our words better than any other species we've known so far. So keep in mind that when you're creating a skill, if you say things out loud, you're kind of already a conversation expert. And if you say it out loud and it takes you, more than a couple of breaths to say, you use some, multi-syllable words that don't roll off the tongue that nicely, chances are it won't sound all that great in Alexa's voice either. So you're kind of the expert. You already have a lot of knowledge that will help you.
Yeah. That's a really good tip. So this is a natural segue into my next question, which is if somebody wanted to get a better understanding of what conversational design looks like and best practices that they may want to dive into, I'm sure you have an incredible resource that they could all dip into, don't you?
We do. It's the Alexa Design Guide, alexa.design/guide. And that is where we will land to direct you all kinds of places, depending on where you're at in your skill building journey, to get some really quick advice or really in-depth advice. We just did a major update in December, and we added a few resources after speaking with a lot of different developers, different kinds of folks who use the guide. The skill developer community is really diverse. After getting a lot of input, we now have a few things that I'm really excited about. I think people will find useful. So we have a lot more content, of course. There's a lot of content about, basic conversation design. What we were talking about earlier, there's a whole article on just writing briefer dialogues, saying less to say more, essentially. Yeah. We have stuff like that, but then we also have, if you're getting into multimodal and APL design, we have stuff like that. If you're monetizing a skill, that's a subject we could spend and have spent multiple sessions on. We've got a lot of guidelines in there, but we also have, with every article, just checklists. If you already have something in progress, there's probably some advice on the checklist in there that you can implement in your skill right away. Quick win, it's a quick improvement. So whether you have like 5 minutes or like 5 hours to dive into something, you should be able to find something helpful there to get you on your way wherever you are. One other thing I'm really excited about too is what I just said was you have to hear things out loud to really understand how, your customer is going to hear them. And one of the things that we have in the design guide now is some audio examples. There's still like a transcript in there, but there's a lot of audio examples in there. Hopefully video someday, although there's just also so much I want to share in the design guide. I have a whole backlog. One day there should be some videos in there too. So really.
Well, and those audio samples that you have in the design guide, those were done by like a professional voiceover artist, right?
Those are me for now. Those were done when there really weren't that many people in the office, kind of beginning in December, or people were super busy at the beginning of December. So that's just Alexa and I doing our thing.
Nice.
And then in the future, I'm you're probably going to hire Jeff in there one day. I'm going to get some other folks to record voices, but it's me for now.
But since you did them as part of your job, you are now a professional voiceover artist, so it all works out.
Apparently, I should put that.
Never thought about it that way, right?
Right, that's very true.
So I want to ask something too. Aside from the varying responses, which we talked about a little bit, what would you say are your top design tips for a good conversation design, if you had to pick a few?
Oh, those fall into two categories. I think one would be kind of how I go about the process to maybe get a better result, but then there's also just the things that I do and do not do and don't think Alexa should do or any voice assistant should do, and things I think that they should do. So as far as the process goes, we talked about one thing, which is just saying stuff out loud. And if you're going to be doing a lot of dialogues, a little productivity hack also is Oh, when I need to write a conversation for the first time, I will just like go for a hike and talk to my phone and record my voice, and I kind of end up with some more natural stuff that way. So maybe give that a try, but always listen to your stuff. I can tell now. I've seen enough designs. I can tell now when someone hasn't listened to something. When they don't send an audio file, but if someone hasn't listened to something, the multi-syllable words, those start to pop up. But also when I plan a design, I use storyboards. I storyboard it just like you would like an animated movie or something. And I create one storyboard for essentially every possible utterance and context and tailored response that I want to create, which sounds kind of exhaustive, and it can be. So I think of everything the person might say, and that's like a new storyboard. If they might say that in various contexts, like the first time I meet them, the second time I meet them, the 10th time they come back to the skill, if they come back to my trivia skill on a winning streak, et cetera, if it's Christmas, whatever, that's another storyboard. And then I write the appropriate responses for those. And it's a good way to visualize how complicated maybe my skill is getting, maybe the responses I still have left to write, et cetera, et cetera. But that's how I tend to design. And then I take that to someone like Jeff or someone else on my team, and I will role play like Wizard of Oz style with my storyboards. And Jeff will say, open the skill, and I'll pull out my welcome message. I'll read my welcome message. Jeff will say the next thing, and I'll rifle through my storyboards and find the next storyboard and say that. So that's a really good way to test your skill without writing a lick of code, to see whether your idea and your flow is working or not. So that process-wise, that's how I go about it.
I like that analogy too. I use that frequently. You said Wizard of Oz style, where you basically just have someone behind a curtain. They can't see you. They can only communicate with their voice. It goes a really long way. Yep. This is a practice you should consider before you write a lick of code, right? This should be one of the first things you think about is what does this story look like? What does this conversation look like? I also loved your reference to hike-driven design. I think that is something that I need to incorporate into my life as the weather starts to warm up here in a month or so. I'm going to do some more hike-driven design. That sounds good.
It kind of works too if you need to write some emails, or like if you're working on a document or something too. I found that it works too. So when you just speak naturally, your writing sound like flows a lot better too.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever hear of
go ahead.
Okay. Did you ever hear of a party game called Parsley? It's exactly that.
Yes.
They give you a book of like responses. You're allowed to be the computer, and then you talk to the other person, and they're only allowed to respond with something that's in the book. It reminds me exactly of your design process.
Wow.
Right.
Jeff, I'll have to show you that book later. It's really
that
funny.
Sounds very cool.
It's very relevant to what we do, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just
and
it's
if it sounds awkward, you probably have some more
Right.
storyboards or responses to make, and if it flows really good, you're probably ready to start coding your design for sure.
All right. Well, I'm sure we're going to pull some more tips out of your brain here in a moment, Allison, but we have a ton of conversations happening in the chat.
Yeah.
I'd love to dig in a little bit and see what people have thoughts on. There's a bunch of questions in here as well. So I want to welcome all of the folks that are here in the chat. And if you do have any questions for us, for Allison, or whatever, please drop them in the chat. We'd love to have a conversation with you. Early on, we had, where did his name go? Oh, Soundmaster AJ said he's based in Idaho. And Dana Voice said, your own private Idaho. We went on a whole B-52s reference here in the chat. Then Brian Tarbox brought it back to Alexa and said, I wish Alexa itself had that kind of context. If I've said no several times to some suggestion, it should not re-suggest the same thing. I think that I see that in the first-party experiences that we see on Alexa, but certainly that's something that's very doable in a third-party experience, but it's definitely a good bit of advice. If someone keeps turning down, for example, an in-skill purchasing prompt, stop offering it. Like at some point,
right?
it's good to get the point, right?
Right, you could do a cooling off period too. Another one is even if you think you're offering something helpful, like you're offering, notifications or something like that, and you prompt the person, you should proactively ask people to use features every so often. That's not a bad thing to do. But also, once you say no once or twice, if they say no once, definitely for most things, whether it's an upsell or an offer for some other kind of content they might be interested in, doing it again that session is probably ill-advised, and then you'll have to decide when to do that again, and then how many times that should fail when you should take a cooling off period. And it's different for every skill and every use case, and it depends.
Yeah. All right. So Alan Furstenberg has a question here, prisoner 4044. And his question is, what tools are there in ASK that support the level of conversation design that we're talking about? And he uses the examples of like visit counters. How do I know if they've been here multiple times? Ways to pick different replies based on specific scenarios or usage cases. Things like randomizing replies. And the reason that I think he's asking this question is because I know I do this quite frequently, right? I am building skills all the time, and I'm thinking about how do I solve this problem, but I'm building it for myself, and it's from scratch. You may enlighten me here, Alison. I don't know if any of this stuff exists, but do we have any of those kinds of tools just built in? Or is this something that generally a developer has to build themselves?
Well, annoyingly, that depends. So as far as analytics go and finding out, maybe where customers are dropping off, anything that has to do with in-skill activities, you can find utterance history in your analytics tab, or maybe that's a separate tab there. But in your analytics tab, you can get to utterance history. You can get to basically an utterance evaluator where people are dropping off. And then you can also, in your skill, of course, with the user ID, assign a user ID essentially, and track how many times somebody's been to the skill, et cetera, et cetera. So there are things you can do in the developer portal and in your skill. Maybe you're aware of others, Jeff. As far as the design itself, this is a huge pain point in conversation design in general. And it's just part of the joys of being in a new technology, in a new space. And I love that conversation design. It's we say at Amazon, it's always day one.
Right.
I'm always learning something. I've been doing this for almost 6 years. I'm always learning something.
Agreed.
Part of that joy is, maybe you don't have as many advanced tools for design. There's so many advanced design tools out in the world, but graphic design as a profession has been around for a very long time. Voice design, not so much. The kinds of conversations that you can have with the technology available to us today have existed a few weeks, a few months, a few years in some cases. So frustratingly, there are a few different disparate tools that different folks have made where you can, in a very bespoke way, maybe like draw a logic chart and write some responses and get like a bit of a chart and a prototype going. There are lots of design tools that can do that. And some of the industry tools that people are excited about are like voice flow. Adobe XD has a little bit of voice support. So there's some of that, but none of it really like translates to code. So you end up having to, code all of it, and the artifact doesn't get used kind of beyond.
I feel like there's a big opportunity for Amazon to introduce a lot of those things. And the only tool that I can think of that specifically answers Prisoner's question here is about randomizing replies. Now, this is not a full-blown reply randomization engine. But if you are doing things that require slot validation, where you need the ability to have like you want to make sure that a user is saying something that is appropriate for a slot, or you want to confirm it, or anything like that, as part of your interaction model, you can actually provide responses that Alexa will use to confirm what the user is going to say. And you can provide dozens of them, and Alexa will choose one at random. That is about as far as I've seen us go into the speech randomization world. But if you are doing any kind of slot confirmation or slot validation to make sure that users are providing values that you want, that is a really good starting point. And I think it's a good model to look at, like, oh, how do they do this and how do they handle these scenarios? That seems to work pretty well. And speaking of randomization, David Curley had a question on Twitch that said, and again, for Amanda and Allison's benefit,
Right.
and for anybody else that's watching, I do a lot of skill development. I do streaming on my own channel. And as part of that, I consistently have this pattern where I build a database table that I call speech. It has all of the values. I mentioned that earlier, but each value has a label. And so I'll have welcome messages. I'll have another message called welcome first that are only used the first time you come to the skill, because those sound different than something that when you return, right? Then I'll have dozens and dozens of other kinds and types. So that relates to David's question here, which is when you do that random sentence fragment thing, do you have a setting to turn it off so that automated tests will work, or do you just not bother with automated tests? So in the current skill that I'm building, I actually don't have a lot of automated testing, although I highly recommend it for anything that you guys are building. One of the ways that I have done automated testing on this before, because anytime you introduce randomization into your application, it's hard to test it because you don't know, you can't predict what value you're going to get. So the way that I've solved this with my automated testing is I mentioned each one of my string values also has a label, right? It's a welcome or a welcome first or something like that. And so what I do is I test against that message type, not the message itself. And so I'll write my tests against those individual message types. And that way it is predictable. I know I should expect a welcome first message here or a welcome message or whatever. And those things are very testable because it is consistent and predictable and testable. So those are things that I recommend. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit. Tapster mentioned that persistent attributes stored in DynamoDB is how they handle this kind of stuff. And I agree. I think that where Prisoner's question came from was, are there built-in tools to handle this for me automatically? But as Tapster has mentioned here, there are lots of opportunities for us to handle this on our own, right? Whether I use DynamoDB or Airtable or a Google Sheet or whatever it is, all of those things are options for me to persist and save data about my user and then retrieve them. I think what Alan was asking for was something that was easier, simpler, more straightforward, without having to write all the code and build the data structures and have the API that calls back and forth. So, could we as Amazon be better? Absolutely, always. But I think for where we are today, there's still a decent amount of things that you have to build yourself.
David Curley said something interesting also on the vein of randomization. He mentioned APLA. And I think randomizing some of your on-screen responses can be highly effective. I'll give you an example that we like to talk about often because it's so much fun is the NORAD Track Santa skill. I know it's February, but you can still ask, where is Santa? You can ask your device, where is Santa? And the skill uses a lot of imagery that's randomized. So you might get a trivia question against a different background every time. When the skill says goodbye, there might be a reindeer waving goodbye. There might be a snowman waving goodbye. If you ask in July, maybe there will be Santa surfing on the beach. And when you ask on Christmas Eve, you'll get to see where Santa is. So we randomize from a large bank of images for that skill as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'm a big fan of randomization. I think it goes a long way.
It adds a little bit of delight to the experience because you never know exactly what you're going to get. A little bit of unpredictability.
And that goes back to what Alison was saying earlier. A lot of users, at least early on, will experiment and see what are they going to get and how's it going to work. And this encourages that kind of behavior when they get something new every time. David has another question about the prompt library. He said, do I share my table between skills, my speech table, and keep all the prompts really generic, or do I clone it and refine it for each skill that I want to use it in? The answer is that I clone and refine. Now, for a number of skills, I have built myself probably about 150 different goodbye messages. And Alison, I don't know if I've shared this with you, but I have a bunch of interesting goodbyes in there. There's the really standard quirky ones like see you later, alligator, and after a while, crocodile. But a lot of people don't know that there's about another 50 different variations on that theme that are different animals. Bye-bye butterfly is a good example. And so I've included a bunch of those, but there's also a lot of great goodbye messages that are movie quotes. And so I've mixed a bunch of those in. And so I've slowly grown this like goodbye catalog of messages. And that seems to get copied and moved to each skill that I have, because it's a fun way to say goodbye. Unless I need a very themed or specific goodbye, I'll just use that list. But it is cloned and refined for each one. I think it would be very hard to stay generic enough, especially when you think about like welcoming people to your skill, right? You would want the name of the specific skill.
Right. Thomas Lawrenson mentioned something worth saying is the target audience and skill type sometimes dictates that you know, expectations. And that's, you know, a very common theme in skills that I have worked on improving is meeting the user's expectation of what your skill should be able to do. You'll find a lot of that in like kind of some utterance history of, you know, what utterances are failing in your skill after you launch it or when you test it. But yeah, it wouldn't be super appropriate for my banking skill to
I was just thinking that
after Wild Crocodile, but totally acceptable in an entertainment skill, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, maybe if you're trying to call your insurance company skill up, you maybe wouldn't want Bye Bye Butterfly. But if it's a trivia skill or a game skill, then that's more fun and entertaining.
But maybe depends on the personality you want to wrap into this thing. That would be the greatest banking skill I've ever heard of. Because you know, you think about things like banking and insurance, and they always keep it very dry and boring. But we could mix some personality in. I think that would be great.
Right.
Speaking of personality. Startup Sanatana in India mentioned when you talked about the most evolved communication animals ever, and then Brian Tarbox jumped in and he said he says this is true. As a former bottlenose dolphin researcher, he challenges your assertion about the most evolved communication. I want
to know more. I want to know more. I want to know if the bottlenose dolphins can be taught to do conversation.
I have nothing more to offer that conversation, but I'm interested to know now this battle. I want Alison and Brian on camera arguing over who's more evolved.
That's actually fair. And, you know, I'm also a kind of part-time fungi collector and all-around geek. And I have recently learned that fungi use their roots to communicate with plants around them. So I would also question my assumption. We could put an asterisk on it that says sort of that we know of. I'd like to learn from dolphins, though, because communication via sound is very interesting to me. And I'll take this moment to also plug the Alexa Skills Kit sound library. Communicating with sound and not using your words is also very effective. And to use a really obvious example, when you get a trivia question wrong or right, but it can also serve as a marker for somebody, you know, when they're starting a different kind of experience in your skill or completing a different kind of task. You can use sound to communicate information without saying more words too.
Yes.
To take a page out of the dolphin handbook.
Yeah. And the sound effect library is exhaustive. I was telling Alison yesterday, I've built a database that is starting to be searchable, but I know for a fact there are 3,018 sound effects in that library because
it's so much more than you could imagine. There's like what, a dozen different laser sound effects alone, right?
Easily. Yeah. It's really great. And, you know, obviously there are lots of other places to find sound effects online, but free ones, those are the best. Those
right.
are,
and these are built in.
Pretty expensive.
They're already there for you. Don't have to add them or anything. So it's nice.
I had one more thing that I wanted to say. If she said a word that was interesting to you, Alison mentioned earlier that she is an amateur fungi collector. If you want to see some of the most beautiful fungi photos you've ever seen in your whole life, make sure to check out her Twitter, because my goodness, when she's doing her hike-driven design, she finds some cool stuff. And the photos you've posted are just remarkable. So thank you for sharing those with the world.
One of the perks of living in the Pacific Northwest, it's very damp. It's a lot of fungi diversity.
For sure. And just getting into the television show, I played the game The Last of Us, but watching the show, it's a reminder just how far I want to stay away from fungi.
It's funny. The fungus in the show, it's like a cordyceps thing. I forget the full name of it. it really does do the things to like grasshoppers and stuff like that, but there's just like no way for that to happen in humans. But it's horrifying enough to see it in the wild in like a grasshopper.
Yeah.
There are other fungi that like if inhaled are like deadly. And there's some that would like really upset your stomach, but nothing that would really like come for you, you know?
Like take over your brain the way they do in the show / game. That's a little bit worse.
Brian Tarbox just asked another interesting question. Alison, I might need your help, and we don't have to answer this on air, but I would love to know if you think that there's somebody that we could get here. His question is, can we get somebody that kind of owns or is responsible for the first-party Alexa experience overall? He said, it seems like Alexa itself does not follow the skill design guide in a lot of the ways that we recommend things, like turning down recommendations or stop asking me for this stuff or whatever. Is there someone or a group of people that own that?
So many people.
Right.
So,
that's the concern, is that it's 100 people working independently.
Yeah. So it's interesting the way that like first party design is similar and different too, and what, you know, where are the seams, I would call them. So there are a couple of people I'll suggest to you offline to reach out to as well, who could come speak to some of the 1P experiences. To speak about the differences though, because we do have kind of an internal way of like doing things. We almost have like our internal version of the Alexa design guide that is specific to, you know, 1P use cases. And then we have, you know, Alexa.design/guide. Which is like written for 3P skills. And you're right, they don't behave the same way. And sometimes they don't follow the same best practices. Depending on what we're talking about, sometimes that's for a really good reason. And sometimes it's because the technology for both of them, excuse me, they're still catching up with each other. The use case, but sometimes we make those experiences different for a reason. That might have to do with like a customer expectation, or we want people to be sure that they understand that they're using a skill versus an Amazon experience. Could be for a lot of reasons.
Okay. I think that makes sense. Going back to the conversation about tools that make it easier to do a lot of the design things that we're talking about, like randomization. Prisoner mentioned that he thinks this is kind of the big failing between voice design and development right now, is that there's so few developer tools that actually support the design best practices. And someone, Drumel161999 on Twitch said, is it possible to add drop-in or connect functionality in a custom skill? Now, I think they're specifically talking about like making voice and video calls directly from a skill, which today is not possible. So I want to answer that question directly. But when I first read that comment, I was thinking, oh man, it would be so nice to be able to drop in this capability like speech randomization and just point it at a database or you know, like maybe I just have another web page inside the developer console that is all of my string management. And then I can just drop in this module and boom, that automatically happens. And I can just assign speech parts and those kinds of things. So I know that's not what Drumo was asking, but it's an interesting perspective, is that we have provided what is basically the lowest possible layer of developer tools to give you the ability to do whatever you want. But I think that one of the things that we should take away from all of this is that there is a big opportunity for us to provide an additional layer of tools that makes everything significantly easier to accomplish a lot of these design practices that we're recommending.
Yep. I've worked with a lot of folks who have achieved and have attempted some really complicated things with their Alexa skills. And one of the frustrations is always, you know, how we have a gap between, you know, what the best possible design would be and then actually implementing it. And a piece of advice I give everybody is to, as best you can, depending on what your skill is doing and the features that you're using, sussing out like what is the most impactful and maybe starting with that, or suss out what are some easy wins and going with that. When you look at the design guide, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and say, this is really hard. It is really hard. Yeah. And I've worked with folks where it's like, well, you could do these 10 things with your skill And that would take a year, and that's really hard. And I don't expect anybody to do all, random 10 things you could do to improve your skill, but maybe the top 2 or 3, those are achievable and super impactful. So definitely biting off something you think would be impactful is one way to be strategic about where you are putting those resources towards some of the hard things. Some of the things where it would be a really great CX, but you need so much context that you're going to have to build in a lot of stuff to track all that information.
This brings to mind a question. I hope you don't mind me asking, but when I think of like what design tool would I use to design a conversation, I'm thinking like flow charts, like maybe a hypertext. Yeah. But what would your ultimate design tool? What features would it have?
Yeah, so when people ask me this, sometimes it's people who are literally trying to work on tools to achieve this. Sure. When people ask me this, I start with a storyboard. I think about the storyboard method I discussed earlier. That's a very granular view of a very exact situation, what the customer said and what I want to say to that specific customer in that context. We also need a way to zoom out and see all of the logic that's in play. How do you arrive at that one response? Is it the first time the customer's been there? Is it not? Did they link their account and I know a whole bunch more stuff about them? Or did they not link their account? Are they subscribed? Are they not subscribed? So you can double click on any one of those places and then zoom in and see what that full response is. Because when people are grappling with these very complicated skills, there's the need to both get very granular and say, in this specific circumstance, we have to say this, versus, generally what's going on here, what does the skill do, and understanding what kind of logic you're working with. So any tool that does that would need to have those 2 views. And so when I try not to, because I don't use a specific tool myself because I haven't found the perfect thing, but anything that allows you to create very easily and toggle between those 2 views would be a great tool. And you might be able to replicate that format in something that you're familiar with already. So if you're a designer, maybe it's like Adobe Illustrator, but if you don't know anything about that, you can open up PowerPoint and replicate the same format. You can use that format anywhere. So in my view, those 2 things have to exist together, the 10,000 foot view down to the granular view.
Yeah.
That's really great. Agreed.
All right. So there was a couple of other questions in here that I want to make sure I grab. Some people were talking about how they have built a routine for themselves. We were talking about first party experiences and how it doesn't always follow a lot of the practices. And I know that there are a lot of users that have voiced their concerns, especially the developers here on this channel, about the by the way functionality that Alexa has, where she will, after you've asked something simple like what's the weather, she'll be like, hey, by the way, here's something else you might want to know or do. And that people have figured out that you can ask it to stop doing that, but it's a 24-hour freeze. And so if you say stop by the way or whatever, for 24 hours, she will stop doing that. And so Big Bold Flank here on Twitch said he actually created a routine that just says that to Alexa every day at noon. So that the by the way, I think that's a clever hack.
I love learning how people use or like misuse products just in general. I love the psychology of it. In fact, Alexa was very popular at my grandparents' house for a while because they would use Alexa to like settle arguments and set reminders for someone to take out the trash because they keep forgetting, or leaving cheeky notes and things like that. It's really funny to me the way that people use Alexa.
Yeah. We had that trash reminder too, because when we moved to a new neighborhood, trash day was a different day. So we had to remember this is the day we take the trash out. Simple.
Yep.
Yeah, over the holiday break, I was visiting a friend, and his dad was there. Dad's kind of older, early 80s. And I found him, like, we were talking, and I just saw him constantly pulling out his phone and typing something in. And eventually I caught a look over his shoulder, and what he was doing was he's creating all of these little calendar events for himself. But he was like manually going into his calendar, adding a new event, typing a thing in. And it was little things like, remember to put the car keys on the countertop. Remember, like, all these little reminders for himself. And he had Alexa in his house. I was like, do you know that you could do a lot of this stuff for you by just like talking out loud? And he said he was floored. That would save me so much time, because he was managing every time a thought popped into his head and he needed to remember to do it, he would just add that to his calendar so that like 3 hours later it would remind him, hey, by the way, take out the trash, or clean your glasses, or whatever it was.
That segues into a good tip, actually. If you're looking for skill ideas, or you're maybe rolling a couple concepts around in your head, whenever you can tie a skill to something someone might already do every day, that could be a hit. For example, there's a really popular kid skill that helps kids brush their teeth for the right amount of time. That's a daily habit. It's adorable. You can, and it's something, if that were not a child-directed skill, you could set a routine for it. So
is that the Chompers one, or is there another?
Yeah. That one. Yeah. Chompers.
The other reason that I'm a big fan of that one is because not only does it get them to brush their teeth, but it asks them a trivia question about animals or something interesting, and they don't get to hear the answer until they brush their teeth that night, which I think is so great. So all day they get to spend time thinking about what could the answer to that question be, and then they're like anxious to go back and brush their teeth to hear the answer that night. It's pretty cool.
That's genius. I love it.
One other question coming from Dana Voice for you, Allison, is have you been involved at all in building any of the Alexa widgets?
Building, not personally, but I have worked on skills that do use widgets. That's going to be a really interesting lever. There are a lot of levers outside of your skill that you can use to drive people back into your skill, and that's going to be an interesting one. And I know people are doing really interesting and novel things with the widgets. Some of the skills that I'm familiar with, it's mostly launching into the skill to like play some content, but other people are doing interactivity like right on the widget. So really interesting stuff people are doing. It's not what I would have thought of, and it isn't what I thought of first. So I'm watching other folks use it with great interest, actually.
Right. It's interesting that you bring up that point, because I think it's the opposite parallel to what people were asking for, which is more advanced tools, more ability to get to design. When you give someone a blank canvas like widgets, they're going to do things that you had never anticipated or predicted or whatever. Yep. But if we gave them a very rigid set and said, well, you can put an image here and like a bit of text, like that would be all that they really ever did with it. And so I think it's really beneficial sometimes to make sure that people have access to the raw resources to shape it the way that they best see for their purposes. But I can see where when best practices emerge, then the tools should follow. And I think for some of these design practices, they are clearly best practices.
Yeah, that plays out. It plays out a lot like that in the real world when something like this launches, and this is one of my favorite things about my role personally, is working with folks who are the first to adopt something, maybe in a private beta program, or we're working with them on a launch, and they're given, maybe the early draft of the tech doc, the private beta version of the tech doc, and they come to me with a design, and I read the tech doc and I read their design, like, you did what with it? Really? Tell me more, And these days my reaction is like, oh, great, bring it on. This is wonderful. Let's make this work. But it used to be like, oh, you really did that with it. I love that, and that's part of what I love about voice too, is nobody knows everything.
True. I try to sometimes, but I am very unsuccessful at that.
I want to make a brief note too before we run out of time. I saw Soundmaster AJ's comment on Twitch asking about developer body double time. You should follow Jeff's Twitch channel, because he's been doing. And
he does. Actually, Soundmaster and I have had a couple of private conversations about how he's really enjoyed the live streaming that I'm doing on my channel, and how I think he wishes there was more of that. So we'll figure that out. I haven't even been able to do it yet this week, but I will without question. Beyond tomorrow and Thursday, and probably Friday as well. So make sure you guys tune in. You can find me on my channel. It's at Jeff Blankenburg. We're going to try and do some more interesting things with that. You may even see those streams move over to this channel. So we'll see what happens, but I'll keep you guys updated as we go. Speaking of that, Amanda, we are quickly running out of time here, and so I want to make sure
this has been such a great conversation.
Put a nice bow on this. So at the beginning of this broadcast, you reminded everybody about what next week's episode was going to be. As we leave, can you remind them all what you said?
Right. So next week, again, we're going to be talking with Kunal Chara. We're going to be talking about skills A/B testing, which is a really valuable way to do your testing experimentation through the developer portal, and skills account linking. So I think it's going to be 2 really interesting topics. Hope you guys tune in for that.
Yeah. Well, Alison, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time with us today. I would take any hour you would give to sit and talk about voice design. So I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I thought this just flew by. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and go visit the design guide, alexa.design/guide, and leave feedback. Hit the little feedback widget. I'm updating every quarter, so send your suggestions my way.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Anything you guys can do as you're working through the design guide or just giving it a review, if there's something you see that you want to know more about, use that feedback widget that's on the page. I think they would love your feedback. It should also be mentioned that there is a feedback widget on all of our tech docs as well. So anytime you feel like something's missing or it's confusing or whatever your experience happens to be, share that with us. That goes a long way in helping us understand. And Alison, I think you have direct access to that feedback there, right? So you should be able to see what's going on.
Yep, it'll go directly to me. I'll get everything.
Nice.
And I do
great.
a little activity at the beginning of every quarter to look at that stuff and prioritize what I can address.
Cool. All right. Well, that is going to be it for us today. Again, Alison, Amanda, thank you guys both for being here and sharing your thoughts on this conversation. Thank you, everybody in the crowd.
Wonderful conversation.
Yeah, we can't do this without all of you. So having you here, asking your questions, sharing your thoughts and ideas, and talking with each other is absolutely awesome. And I really appreciate it. If you want more of the kind of conversation that you're seeing in the chat, I also recommend checking out our Slack channel. If you aren't already there, we're well over 3,000 people now, and there are people there every day having conversations about voice design, development, design, everything you can imagine under the sun related to Alexa. And so if you're not already there, you can find it at alexa.design/Slack. Come on in and join us. You can find me, Alison, I think you're there, Amanda's there. So if you want to reach out and say hi, we would be happy to say hi back. But with that, that's going to be it for us today. Thank you guys all for tuning in, and we will see you next week.